One of the funny scenes in the Harry Potter franchise is when the young students are trying to learn how to change one object into another, say a flower into a candle or a rat into a teacup. So they say the magic words, they flick their wand, and wouldn't you know, the rat transformed into a china cup and saucer. However, they are just learning how to do this spell, and instead of becoming Royal Dalton, the rat becomes a cup with a tail. It's a partial transformation, not quite successful. The class that the kids are in was called Transfiguration. And these days, that's the only time that we use that word other than the story that we have read today in the Bible. Transfiguration is not part of our everyday language anymore. And it's not all that helpful when it comes to Jesus either, because Jesus is not changed. It would be more accurate to say that something that was part of who he was all along is displayed in a different way. Today we are considering the Transfiguration of Jesus. Now this is the last Sunday in the season of Epiphany. Epiphany means manifestation or revealing, and ever since Christmas, the gospel lessons have revealed who Jesus is. It begins with the Magi, those foreigners who proclaim that Jesus is the Lord of all the nations. And then there's the story of Jesus' baptism, when the voice from heaven declares Jesus is God's Son. And the stories continue until they culminate with this story, in which Jesus' divine nature is made clear for all to see. Jesus doesn't just become divine. He has been both human and divine all along, but now in his face and in his body, his divinity is revealed. Jesus has taken his inner circle, Peter, James, and John, up the mountain. They have gone to be by themselves. Matthew doesn't tell us exactly what they do on the mountain, but while they are there, Jesus is transfigured. His face shone like the sun. His clothes became as white as the light. So I'd like you to imagine that for a moment. Jesus, no doubt, with dusty feet and stained clothes and unbrushed hair, the same Jesus with whom they have talked and laughed and traveled, is suddenly different. Jesus is glowing with light. It is a holy moment. When we go to the movies, there are often trailers or previews of what's coming next, and that's something of what is happening here. Jesus, standing there in glorious light, gives us a preview of the resurrection, a foretaste of his coming in glory. And it's a glimpse given to the disciples for their benefit and for ours of what is to come, not only for Jesus, but also for us. In the same way, a cube of bread and a sip of juice both satisfies and expresses our longing for the future banquet, a future feast yet to come. The transfiguration of Jesus fills us with both hope and awe for what is ahead. Of course, Jesus is not standing there alone for long. He is joined by Moses and Elijah, both leading prophets, both long dead, and the three of them talk. I wonder what they talked about. Matthew does not tell us. Luke says they talked about Jesus' departure, that is to say, his crucifixion. This is a story of mystery and wonder. To see Jesus standing beside those heroes from the Old Testament reminds us that the New Testament is in continuity with the Old. The scriptures, Old and New Testaments together, declare one long story of God's love and grace that comes to its climax in Jesus Christ. We read the scriptures with Jesus-shaped glasses. The story of Jesus' transfiguration in Matthew is a hinge story. The next act in this great love story of God is the cross. And it is to the cross that this story now turns. Now, we are often hard on Peter. We know that he's impulsive, and certainly in this text he is talkative. How are we to interpret Peter's plan to erect a building, 3 buildings? Luke says that Peter speaks of building booths because he didn't know what to say. Mark tells us that they were exceedingly afraid. But Matthew, which we read today, makes no comment on what Jesus says. But Peter says. Peter just speaks. And given the immediate background to this story, Peter is trying very, very hard to learn from his previous experience and to respond respectfully to what is happening. We are reading chapter 17, but in chapter 16, Jesus and the disciples are in Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus asks them, "Who do the people say that the Son of Man is?" And the disciples say, well, some say it's John the Baptist, some say you're Elijah or Jeremiah or a prophet. And then Jesus pushes them. He says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answers, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." And immediately, Jesus starts to teach them that he must be crucified. Peter is not willing to hear this. He rebukes Jesus, says, "Forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you." And Jesus replied, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block for me. You are setting your mind on things, not on divine things, but on human things." And then Jesus teaches his disciples that they must take up their cross and follow him. Against that background, Jesus' words are remarkably respectful. "Lord," it's a proper form of address. "It is good for us to be here." Well, it was indeed good to be there. "If you wish," Peter is asking, not demanding, "I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Peter speaks well, but he is still struggling with the cross because he hopes that if they build houses up on that mountain, then the people will come to Jesus on the mountain. And if they don't go down to Jerusalem, then maybe Jesus can escape the cross altogether. God interrupts this fantasy by repeating the words that he spoke at Jesus' baptism. "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." And then God adds, "Listen to him." And what is Jesus saying? He is saying that the Son of Man, the Son of God, will be crucified. So there on the mountain, we see both the cross and the resurrection. We see the Son of God glowing, Christ's divinity laid out for everyone to see, but we hear God affirming Jesus' teaching that he must go to Jerusalem where he will suffer and die. This Wednesday is Ash Wednesday. It's the beginning of Lent. And for 40 days, we will hold together this mystery of a glorious Son of God who will nevertheless be crucified. For 40 days, we will acknowledge the cost of the cross and the wonders of God's love, For 40 days, we will consider our own response to the gospel and how we might answer God's call more faithfully. That voice from heaven declaring that Jesus is God's Son, listen to him, is the climax of the story, and that's usually where we give most of our attention. But I want you to notice how the story ends. When the disciples hear the voice from the cloud, they are, of course, terrified. They fall face down to the ground, prostrating themselves in a position of humility and fear. But watch what Jesus does. Matthew writes, Jesus came and touched them. Get up, he said. Don't be afraid. Jesus touches them to comfort and to heal. He reassures them that whatever happens next will be in God's hands, no matter how frightening the circumstances. Don't be afraid. Now, I began this sermon by explaining that Jesus is not changed in this story. Rather, aspects of Jesus' identity that have been true all along have been highlighted. We call this story the Transfiguration of Christ, but it's Peter who is changed. Not all at once, but this is the beginning. Peter is changed by hearing God's voice. He is changed by Jesus' touch. He is changed by Jesus' words of comfort. Don't be afraid. This is the story of the transfiguration of Peter. It is the story of the transfiguration of every person who has heard God's call. Jesus touches Peter and says, be raised. Yes, that's the literal translation of get up, be raised, as in resurrection raised. And as they walked off that mountain, weren't the words listen to him ringing in Peter's ears? Jesus will speak again of his suffering, and Peter will struggle to understand, to follow and be faithful. Actually, Peter will do more than struggle. He will fail. And Jesus will reach out, raise him up again, and send him forth. How many times did Peter look back at this day and say to himself, just listen to him? This is the shape of our lives as Christians. We try our best, sometimes succeeding and sometimes coming up short. We too have moments of insight and moments of denial. We too fall down in fear and are raised up again to go forth in confidence like Peter. We are called to listen, called to discern God's way in the world, called to partner with God, and in this way, be transformed. This is your story. God has called you. And when you falter, and when you fail, God will raise you up. God will give you the strength to continue and send you out again. Don't be afraid. Thanks be to God. Let's pray.